Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third and final installment of Misinformation versus the Machine, the Colorado Sun's exploration of how to encourage and develop a literate approach to consumption and use of news media. This series is sponsored by the Colorado Education Association and supported by the News Literacy Project, and each of the recorded segments is available to review for free online at coloradosun.com/newslit. This week, we'll be discussing defending democracy with the help of three panelists who have special expertise in doing exactly that, defending democracy through political action, education, and journalism. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Mike Webb, who is from the News Literacy Project. He has a long career in both journalism and journalism advocacy across many different shapes and sizes of organizations in the United States. We have Jose Vilson. He's co-founder and executive director of EduColor. He's a math educator, writer, activist, and dad. EduColor seeks to elevate the voices of public school advocates of color on educational equity and justice. And finally, we have our local Amanda Gonzalez. She's the Democratic nominee for Jefferson County Clerk and Recorder. She's currently director of lawyer engagement at We the Action, where she empowers attorneys to volunteer with leading nonprofits to use their time and talent for good, one project at a time. You may recognize her because she's a former executive director of Colorado Common Cause, where she fought for open, honest, and accountable government. So today we're going to take a look at tools that educators can use to help sort of sort through the chaff of misinformation as they're helping guide young charges. Well, anybody can use these tools actually in sorting through the sort of fire hose of information that every kid in a classroom, every human who has a cell phone experiences every single day of their lives unless they're super disciplined. I also wanted to mention that we'll probably try and take a little time to at least acknowledge and maybe discuss what happened in a fourth grade classroom down in Texas yesterday, and talk maybe a bit about some misinformation we've seen come out of that tragedy in the community of Uvalde, and consider how the politics of guns might come up in classrooms. So who wants to go first on the actual mainstream of what we're up to today? Mike?
Sure. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm with the News Literacy Project, and we provide a lot of different resources for people to use to learn how to become news literate. And so if you go to our website, newslit.org, and go to the For Everyone section, you'll see a lot of different things, like a newsletter that we have that has examples of misinformation and how they've been debunked. We've got an app called Informable that helps people train themselves to learn the different types of information that they might see. We've got a podcast that you can listen to called Is That a Fact? So we have a ton of different resources that'll help you really understand what's fact and fiction in the news and information you come across.
And are these tools targeted for grown-ups? I know I took one of your quizzes after we talked last week. So it seems like there's plenty of grown-up application, but are they targeted in a way that they're applicable for you to use for your kids, use for your kids in your classroom, use for yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. For the public, we have, like you said, we've got different quizzes and infographics that people can use, and the quizzes are instructive because we've got one called Should You Share It? And it shows is it legit or should you share it? I forget, we have so many. But one shows the types of information, misinformation that's shown to conservatives, and the types of misinformation that's shown to liberals, progressives. And that way you can sort of determine get a better understanding of how people are being misled on both sides. So that's really for an older audience and very helpful. And then if you go to our For Educators section, you'll see all the tools that are available for young people.
And these are all free, right?
Everything is free, yeah.
Okay. And I guess we bring up the real question is, like, why do we need this? Why do we need these tools? What's going wrong in the spread of information out in the world, and why is it critical that we get these skills? I guess I'm thinking about our own state of politics in Colorado right now, where we're looking at a primary where people on the top line of the ballot are the election deniers in our state. It's a very confusing time for adults, and must be also extremely confusing for people who are trying to teach young adults or even little kids in a classroom. So did I answer my own question?
I'm happy to take a shot, but I also want to share the stage with others.
Yeah, or anybody can talk, but
yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. So when I was at Common Cause during the 2020 election, we had our largest volunteer base ever. Actually, we had over 1,100 volunteers volunteered because they wanted to make sure that the election was safe and secure for everyone and fair. And when we did some deep dives into training people, a lot of adults, right? A lot of people who had been using the internet for decades didn't realize that social media sites use algorithms, right? And that they were seeing very specific content that wasn't necessarily vetted, right? Even many adults, let alone kids that might be in classrooms, don't sort of realize that the information that they're seeing on the internet, on TikTok, on Facebook, A, hasn't been vetted, and B, is being curated for things that the internet thinks you like, right? And so how do adults and children sort of get really good information, especially when we're talking about information about civics, voting, and our government, of how do we all be, informed folks that are participating in civic life? And I think that's very hard both for adults and for young people.
As somebody was asking me the other day, like, why do you need to do that? Why do you need to do that? Someone in my age group. And I said, well, dude, when we grew up, there was, a couple TV stations in the local newspaper, and maybe you subscribe to a statewide newspaper or a national newspaper. And I think that is like the key element, even for me today, because I'm 100% affected my streams by the algorithm, and it's like cute shoes. And also, and you do go down rabbit holes very easily. And so I guess I wonder if we can talk a bit about, how do we develop the discipline, and where do we find the tools that help us to understand when we're being manipulated, and how do we apply that in our lives as, good citizens of America, whether we're good citizens on the left or good citizens on the right, like, focusing on the truth.
It's interesting that, and I'm hearing this conversation, of course, like I'm hearing this from two lenses. This one is this burgeoning sociologist from Teachers College, and of course, I have a billion theories around why this all works, surely. But then the math teacher in me is telling me that so much of, like, just as an allegory, I suppose, math teaching suggests to me that a lot of my students think that getting something quick is the same thing as getting something right. And so what I often find is that when we have a conversation about how to get something right, it always says, oh, well, if we just get it very, very quickly, then we're going to get this math correctly. But then when you actually look at a lot of the standards that are out now, especially around math practices, you're seeing things like constructing viable arguments, taking your time to do things, using appropriate tools strategically. And so a lot of what I did with my math pedagogy is analogous to the things that we can actually do when it comes to looking at misinformation and any other anti-truth type movements, and really get a good sense of what's happening. So it reminds me, for example, that like I have a bunch of students who follow me on Instagram, and like I'm like, okay, no problem, I'll follow you back, and I'll see some of their stories. Some of them post from different sources, whatever. There was one story that suggested that there was over 1,000 symptoms that came out of vaccines and taking them. And of course, like they were like, oh, the sensational headline. Let me go look at it. And I said, you know what? Today I'm gonna engage this one because I want to see what's happening. And sure enough, I dig into the actual report, and sure enough, like the vast majority of these 1,000 or so symptoms actually came from like people self-reporting these things, not that they were actually verified from the doctors. And then the ones that were verified were the ones that like doctors surely were already mentioning, like, getting a little nauseated, feeling headaches, like mild symptoms that you generally get from any other vaccines. But of course, I didn't stop there. I said, let me actually talk to my former student, because we already had a trusting relationship from the classroom that we were in. And so, long story short, he was like, oh, like nobody ever took the time to explain that to me. See, this is why you're the GOAT. I'm like, thank you, I appreciate that, but I just want to be very thankful for being able to have that trusting space. And I think that's what a lot of us need. Is like that. It's a lot like cooking. Sometimes you need that slow cook to really get the flavor out. And I really wish that more people took real serious and sincere time to like let something bake or let something marinate before they dive into a topic.
Yeah, that's great, Jose, and that's something that we try to teach people to do. There's basically 5 simple things that you can do to help yourself verify information. Like, do a quick Google search and see if there's other people reporting the same thing. Make sure you're getting the information from a standards-based news organization that is trustworthy, and they'll do things like they'll be very transparent. They'll talk to multiple sources. And then we'll also ask you to just look at how they handle errors. When they make a mistake, they're usually going to post about it and try and correct it right there within the story so that you can see what the error was. And then we just generally encourage people to assess other news coverage. Don't just stick to the sources you only read. Look across the spectrum and see how other people are reporting on this. So that's how you get better information.
I think that people also are, and to your point, Jose, actually reading the story and then clicking the links and searching for the original reports and the information and maybe going back and reading them. I had a similar experience to you where I was fed a Facebook post that said the World Health Organization was suggesting that women stop breastfeeding their babies, was basically it in developing nations. And it was crazy town, and I thought, wow, that does not sound like who. And I'm an experienced enough human being that I had like the thing in my head that said that isn't a right thing. And so I went searching for the report, and it was a very specific thing, which was if they were trying to figure out whether something passed the breast milk barrier vaccination in a country where you had disease and you kind of really bad disease, and it would be worth it to dump breast milk for a couple of weeks in order to be vaccinated for this deadly disease. But it was packaged up for my chiropractor's office, and it took me, a professional researcher, probably 25 minutes to get back to the original report and read the summary of it. And I just thought, wow, how do people who, have lives consume this information appropriately and know not to pass it on?
Yeah, context is very important. People will often take something that was accurate, but if you take it out of context, then you can exaggerate something or really just kind of mislead people with it.
For your purposes. And I guess maybe that's a question for you, Amanda. In your work, it might behoove an alternative healthcare provider, and I do not believe this about my chiropractor at all, to suggest that something was bad in order to drive traffic to their practice. And I can imagine that we see this in politics a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a lot of that is around overwhelming people, right? That if you don't know sort of what is true, what is honest, what is factual, then it encourages you to disengage, right?
Interesting.
And when I was at Common Cause, and actually as somebody who hopes to run the elections in Jefferson County in the future, our goal and my goal is always participation. I think that our democracy is inherently stronger when we all participate and when everybody's voice is at the table. And I think a lot of this disinformation that is out there, right? So we were training folks on both misinformation, which is unintentionally misleading content, as well as disinformation, which is intentionally misleading content. We were training them about how to look for this in a political context, right? A lot of the both mis and disinformation that was being shared during the 2020 elections were happening in private Facebook groups, right? Spaces where you did see trusted messengers, right? Maybe you're in a mom's group for your local neighborhood and you feel like you know the other moms, right? You trust them. And so you value what they're saying about the election or about politics without maybe really thinking, oh, hey, is this accurate? Is this vetted? Is this good information? And what is its goal, right? Because oftentimes I think that confusion at best is just confusion, and you see a post and you're like, I don't know if that's true. And at worst, I think it can actually, in terms of politics, even suppress the vote, right? Either by confusing people to the point where they just don't participate and they don't trust, or where they're getting wrong information that actually keeps them from participating. And so I think this is a really important thing to be talking about, with young people as we are encouraging them to get involved in civic life, and also with adults to make sure that they are participating, that their voice continues to be heard in their local community.
And I know, Jose, it sounds like you serve as a trusted source for some of the kids in your math classes. But maybe you could talk a little bit about how we train or develop the spidey sense to know who somebody is going to be your trusted guide in social media, or even in your news media.
It's tough, but it's worth doing. And so, what I often find is that the teacher, and I have politics that may be different from whatever the spectrum is, but generally speaking, I do like to be as straightforward with the facts and where I get these sources from. But that comes second to me asking just good questions, like saying, how are we feeling about this event? Let me open up space for y'all to say what you need to say. And there's going to be varied opinions all across the board. Usually, some of them come across in different ways than others. But then they may at some point ask me what my specific opinion is. I'm like, I do have an opinion on that, but I'm gonna hold off for a second until we get a good a coalescing of what are some things that we can pull apart, whether they be fact or opinion, so on and so forth. And then I end up building out a way of saying, this is a community that we can trust with each other, right? And so here's some things that I want everyone to get a good look at, and I could care less about left, right? I mean, there's things to be said on many multiple sides of this thing, but there are facts, there are straight up facts, and some of these things we have to be able to acknowledge in order for us to move the conversation forward. So for me, it's very much start off with just trying to build a sense of trust, a sense of openness about how we do this thing. To Amanda's point, right? That's how democracies really work, is being able to do the tug and pull with each other, and really trust each other enough to disagree. But then secondly, being able to come in as that moderator, as that sound voice, and say, I've done a lot of reading on this, and here are the things that I've come up with. It may be incomplete, but it's a whole lot harder than maybe that one little snappy tagline that you're going to get from the news. And I think that that's worth acknowledging too, is I tell people straight up, this is how I came to what I got. And I hope that everyone can follow my path towards that, higher learning. So that could be a way for us to do it. But then, of course, that also means that adults need to practice that too within their professional developments, because unfortunately, a lot of our pedagogy when it comes to professional development sessions is very much a one-way transaction, instead of trying to build a community of learners where people always talk to one another. And that's part of the democracy building that we're trying to do too.
And I think that's something that we encourage in people, is a healthy skepticism. We don't want people to be cynical and to doubt everything that they see, but it's okay to ask yourself, that doesn't sound right, or I'm not sure, I want to check that. So I think it's really healthy to sort of approach information with a healthy skepticism.
Totally with you. That's the whole journalism thing, right? If your mom says that she loves you, check your sources. So I was wondering, and I know I shared my thing and Jose shared his, but have you, Amanda or Mike, had some experience you want to share with the audience about, trying to help kids find their way, or individuals find their way that's specific, and some tips along with it?
Well, one of the things I like to share with people is it takes some time to get used to sort of checking yourself, because I remember recently there was a video going around of Tom Brady, the football player, throwing a football into one of the throwing machines, and the ball shot it to him, and then he threw it back and it went right in. And when I saw it, I was like, wow, that's incredible. And I'm not a Tom Brady fan. But then, it turns out that the person who had shot it had edited it and it was digitally altered. So it wasn't real. So even, and I do this for a living, even I was fooled by that. So I kind of warn people, like, don't beat yourself up just because something might have fooled you, but just be aware that things can be manipulated and that there are people with bad motives who will try and mislead you with false information. So the best thing you can do is just have some of the skills that you can easily check things and verify things so that you're not fooled.
That makes me wonder, and I think this is watching some questions in the chat that sort of lead me in this direction, that is the difference between fact and motive, or difference of opinion and motive, and how do we sort of sort through that? That's the stickiest thing we're going through right now in our political world is, I think that X happened. Facts show something else happened. And that's painful. I mean, and maybe perhaps, Amanda, you probably saw it more than often. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And, I sympathize, I think, as we stated earlier, with people who are like, I don't have time to go find that original source. I don't have 20 minutes. I'm scrolling through my feed and I want the basic information. And so I very much get that. Getting back to some of the examples. So I used to teach Chicanos in the law at a local university as an adjunct. And so most of my students were eligible to vote. And, as we were nearing the election, I said, if you're eligible, I don't care how you vote, just, make your voice heard, go do this. And one of my students said, well, I don't know how to vote on this stuff. The commercials don't tell you enough, right? And I was like, oh, this is fascinating, right? Because this is telling me about where he knows to get information, right? And understanding the difference, speaking of motive, a commercial has a goal, right? It wants you to vote a certain way, or take a certain position on an issue, or purchase a specific thing. And even my students who were midway through college didn't always understand where they could get basic information about a candidate or about a ballot initiative, right? And sort of who was putting out that information, how it was vetted, whether or not, if it was a piece of journalism, whether or not that outlet had standards, right? Was this information being checked, and how to just identify where they were getting their information and where they could get their information. And I think even those very basic pieces are really, really helpful, both for students and the adults that I was teaching at the time.
Mike, Jose, any thoughts about that, either of you?
Yeah, I just was thinking. I see some of the chatter in the Q&A, and I'm just thinking, the New York Times is an example of a standards-based news organization that really produces a lot of high-quality journalism. But the New York Times isn't perfect, and for example, they've come under fire recently because they did a series about Haiti and how France has really kind of held the country back by all this debt that the country has had. And that's something that had been reported by different academics, or not reported necessarily, but it was known because of the work that other academics had done. And the Times really didn't do a very good job of crediting those academics for their work. And so that, people make these arguments about the Times is this or that, and it's not always that. It's really about the quality of the news reporting and doing a thorough job of being as unbiased and giving credit where it's due, your sourcing, all those type of things. So I understand the tendency to say that, this news organization is left or right, but that's really more a matter of the opinion pages that those organizations have. Most, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, their reporting's down the middle. They're trying to get it right more than anything.
Yes, and of course, the sociologist in me and the researcher is like, oh, okay, let's talk about that for a second. Because a big part of me also thinks that um, I think everyone comes in with their bias, right? And everyone, so you can either pretend like you're unbiased, or you can lay out your biases from jump and say, here's the reason why. So, like, well, for example, with that Haiti story, I felt like there were people on any number of sides who said, okay, well, why should I be doing this conversation about Haiti? Like, that happened hundreds of years ago. And besides, like, who cares about Haiti, right? Like, that could be one side of the conversation, and then there's the other side of the conversation that's like, I wish you had, paid more respect to the folks who laid the groundwork for you to be able to do this reporting too. But to say that that story mattered, yes, it matters a lot. And why would that matter? It's good for us to say straight up, this is why this story matters. Like, that's part of the reason why. And I think the media has consistently, especially like national news media, has to probably have a good conversation with itself about what has happened over the course of like the last bunch of decades, as things have kind of coalesced into a few strong handful of people, where local media reporting has kind of lost its a lot of funding in that respect too, right? And so a big part of me is curious about what happens when people feel like they've lost their way within society more generally, and where they start turning to when they don't feel like they can trust anymore. And so those are things that I'm always curious about. It's like, people feel like society no longer perhaps works for them. So they're going to turn to people who can feed them stories that align to that cognitive bias. And so I'm curious about that element as well.
And this sort of leads us into an interesting question from one of our, it looks like possibly an educator, asking how teachers can help navigate these emotionally charged political issues in the classroom. And when I was reading some of that Haiti stuff this week, I had exactly those feelings. I was just, felt sick to my stomach reading about it, and I'm obviously feeling sick to my stomach about the shooting in the fourth grade classroom in Texas, and imagine that there will be some charged political conversations around that in element, maybe among parents, or among parents and teachers, among teachers and the kids. Like, how do we navigate the Second Amendment versus our classmates were killed? It's challenging. Who wants to be brave and go?
Well,
I could. No, go first.
I can talk about some of the another resource that we have is how to speak up without starting a showdown, and that kind of outlines some of the things that people can do to have these conversations. So it starts with just being civil to each other. And of course, my computer is not pulling that up for me. But I mean, it starts with being civil, being patient, giving people room to express themselves and how they feel about things. I really wish this were here.
Let's see, can I?
Maybe we can share that. Yeah, can you share that in the chat?
I think I can. I can share it to Eric, and Eric can share it.
But and then here we go. And I'm sorry. And then take your time, understanding that we're all gonna have different beliefs, and you want to hear from other people. You'll want to try and find common ground amongst each other. There's got to be overlap. Like, let's first agree that school shootings are bad, and that there is something we can do. There are steps that we can take to help prevent them. Be patient and persistent. Understand that people didn't get to their beliefs overnight. They're deeply held and ingrained, and that it's going to take some time to maybe persuade them or get them to understand that whatever conspiracy belief that they might have isn't really based on factual information. And then another thing you might do as an educator is just decide how you're going to have these conversations, and really make sure you create space for everybody to be heard and have a chance to speak about it. So those are, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I actually want to give a shout out first and foremost to Matthew K. Not Light But Fire, which is an excellent book in which he actually discusses a lot of the issues that he had when he's teaching, and he's still teaching. A fantastic, phenomenal teacher out of Philadelphia. But basically, the book goes through some of like the not just the great things that happen when you get into these conversations, but some of the failures too, and the ways that like even those of us who have a particular politic can like fail miserably at getting it right, and that sometimes that's going to happen too. We have to be um it's wild to say this, especially given that, we just went through about 20 plus years of education reform where, we're consistently thinking about over standardized testing and, the hype on that. But we have to create spaces where everybody, including adults, can fail. And fail miserably in front of students and make mistakes in front of students, and then learning how to apologize as authority figures. Those are elements that often contribute to this too. So there have been moments, and of course, me being one of the 2% Black male teachers out there, I'm consistently in spaces where I'm the only one who's gonna have the conversation. So there have been times when I've had to say, okay, I'm gonna set aside my curriculum for a few minutes and handle this very tense discussion because I feel it with my students, but nobody else is going to do it but me. So sure enough, when those moments happen, again, I open up the space, I allow for that failure, but I also allow for that trust. I get vulnerable where possible. And then two, recognizing too that there's a lot of yes ands, right? So the conversation so unfortunately there's people who say, oh, it's either mental health or the politics. And I'm just like, how about and? Yes, and. At this point, there's the point where this 18-year-old was failed. And we have to acknowledge that from a mental health standpoint, and our society could do a much better job with reckoning with, what mental health looks like from very, very early on, and ensure that they have a support system outside of the school building that supports the child. And then make sure that at that 10-year-old, when he was that 10-year-old, that he didn't feel like he was that isolated where he was plotting for 8 years to make, to see whatever transpired there. But then also we need to have securities in case things fail too. Like we cannot have military style weapons out there. Frankly, I mean, I'm a peacenik, so I'm like, I don't want any sort of weapons out there, but particularly ones that like are that effective at killing young children. And so we have to be thoughtful about what, and not to mention all the elders who were murdered just, oh my gosh, a week ago. It's a lot. It's tragic. And so, our society needs to do a much better job of having that conversation because yes, and all these things are happening all concurrently. And so when we can have that yes and conversation, we can do so much more when it comes to the classroom and making our classrooms the microcosm of the thing that we want to see out there in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were talking about being able to fail and apologize even when you're the one who's leading. And I loved Why Won't You Apologize by Harriet Lerner, not specifically about educators, but just a really good frame for exactly what you were talking about. So I was teaching Chicanos in the Law the night that Trump got elected. So it was a Tuesday, Thursday evening class. And many of my students were undocumented. And we came back to class the next Thursday and I had to scrap the lesson plan because for many of my students, they were undocumented. They were really worried about some of the things that they read in the news and some of the policies that President Trump had espoused. And I was the only attorney that they knew. And, we really had to begin from a place of honoring each other's humanity. And we are all humans, right? That we are coming at these issues that, are so ripe for mis and disinformation, but they're ripe for mis and disinformation because they are so important to us and close to our hearts, right? Whether that's immigration or guns or whatever the thing that you care about. And so I think recognizing that we are all human and we are all coming at it with our humanity, I think is also really, really important.
It's been a long time since I've been in a classroom, and I am surprised at the breadth of responsibility that y'all are taking on, generally in your classrooms. And I wonder and I'm just thinking about how do you hold to the academic elements of the discussion. Like, do you make a school shooting about a Second Amendment lesson, or are we scrapping your lesson plans as you did, Amanda, um, to deal with the sort of moment and then move it into, well, here's how we can take a look at the foundational thing that has allowed this to happen, and why is it a political discussion, I guess, is where I'm probably like, let's say, if you're talking about a school shooting or guns in your community, I get that you're going to have the conversation that acknowledges that people are feeling bad or scared or unnerved by the situation. But is there also sort of a duty to say, like, well, here's what our Constitution says about it, and here's how we look at it? Does that make sense?
Cool, Amanda. Oh, okay. I think it really, so one, it depends really on the alignment to whatever standard or whatever content or curriculum you're espousing. Obviously, as a math teacher, a lot of people say, well, you shouldn't be doing politics because yada yada. But I'm like, if I want to be culturally responsive, how can our students trust us with our minds when they can't trust us with their hearts? Like, that's the core reason why I got into teaching. And so they look at me and they say, oh, you're not gonna have anything to say about this? Like, this really happened and you don't seem like you care. Like, that would be a problem. And so I find myself again in consistently in positions where I have to set aside the curriculum, particularly because of what people see already as my politic. Yeah. So rather than try to pretend like I'm apolitical, I'd rather just say, you know what? These are the politics that I believe in, the politics of centering children and communities, and that's why I got into this work to begin with. And so even separate from all the left right stuff, like, it's very much like, this is why I got into this job, and this is why I would love to have this discussion with you. And so opening that space is political. Going through the things and talking about the Second Amendment is a political lesson, surely. But does it have to like have any number of partisan sound bites? As I'm also acknowledging here, no, not necessarily. It could just be, let's have the conversation and have it with somebody who you trust already and who you think has a similar life experience as you. Okay, we can do that, because there's going to be times when a lot of our students aren't getting conversations that are more authentic to their lived experience, because a lot of our students are already, frankly, dealing with a lot of these issues more unfortunately, as randomly and as with any number of disasters currently happening with them. So it's important for us to acknowledge their circumstance and why they would go to an individual and say, I would love for you to talk about this, rather than just coming up in the curriculum when they're in the lesson, because sometimes it's just not going to come up in the same way, or it may not come up as authentically if you don't have that current event to prompt you to do so.
And Amanda, I think you had something.
Well,
motioning in that direction as well.
Slightly different, and there's been some chat on the social media sites about acknowledging our own identities, our own privilege, our own spaces from which we come. Right? We all have our own lenses, and so I think in line with that, Jose, as you were speaking, I was thinking about one of my first classes in law school. One of the first cases that they teach is, I believe it's Johnson v. McIntosh, and it's a property case, but in it they refer to Native Americans as savages, and it's an old case, but there was no conversation about that. I was the first in my family to go to college, let alone law school, and I'm sitting in this class in the first week, and I was like, oh, this isn't for me, right? Because I'm having this reaction to an apolitical matter, but the fact that it wasn't discussed, I think, impaired my learning and my ability to engage with the content, right? And so I think we have to acknowledge some of the dynamics that are at play and what's happening in students' lives and what's happening in the larger context if we're going to talk about how can we create spaces where people can get accurate information, they can engage with accurate information, and they have the tools they need to discern facts, right? I think that is a lot more holistic than maybe we sometimes think of it as.
Is it ever too? Are kids ever too young to have these conversations? Never. Expound, please.
I mean, I wanted to give Mike the mic, but so a lot of our children wake up and the one of their first memories ends up being about the disparity. It's interesting because a lot of our students who already walk the school doors and they can acknowledge the difference between the school that they go through versus the school that maybe a few blocks away, or they're already given a whole bunch of messages about the expectations that are laid out for them, and the way that their parents work and what they have to do to ensure that there's food on the table versus the things that they see on TV, and the difference between in quality, and they already see it, like it's already a lived experience for them. And so I would challenge this notion too, that they don't know what justice is, because I think a lot of our students grow up with a very acute sense of what fair is, what's right and what's wrong. And unfortunately, I think we generally either shake folks out of what's fair, or they start like filtering themselves into whatever position in society more generally. But yeah, no, like our students know from very early like what's supposed to be fair, what's not, as long as we do right by them too. And it's not about, again, not about being partisan, but it is about being like very thoughtful about like what we're trying to say with right and wrong. Like, kids know how to share. Like, why don't adults know how to share as well as kids do? They know how to play with one another. Like, they lay out rules pretty early on when it comes to games. Why can't adults learn how to change rules to ensure that it's aligned to what's happening in the context? There's just so many analogies, but kids just do it better. They do it better.
They're just better. And that brings me to a question right out of that is they are good at it. Like, they're good at seeing stuff. They're good at knowing when things are wrong, or having a sense that things are wrong. So how do we encourage that to become a foundation for their future civic life without shaking it out of them? That might be too big of a question, maybe, but
Well, one thing that we would say is to trust educators. Educators are in the classroom. They're having these conversations with the students. They know the emotional maturity of them. So give them some space to teach. And so the spate of laws that have been passed to really regulate what teachers can say, I think are a little misguided, because they didn't bring educators into the conversation, and they don't leave room for the educators to really lead these conversations. But I think the point that you made about students really having their own good sense of justice is a great one. And I just think that educators really, the purpose is for them to help students learn how to think critically and to weigh evidence and to hear different sides of an argument and then come to their own conclusions about it. It'll be based on their own values and their parents' values that they share. But when you hear others' perspectives, that's going to lead you to a better place and better way of making decisions. So I really wish people would make sure that educators have some say into what happens in their classrooms.
can you explain that just a little bit more?
Well, yeah, I mean, we can point out the quote unquote "don't say gay" laws that were passed down in Florida. I personally, I don't want to speak for my organization, but I personally don't think that was a good idea. I don't think educators were given the space to determine when and where they can have these conversations. There are gay people in life. They exist. Your students are going to encounter them. They probably have an uncle or relative or parent who is gay. And so to just deny their existence is mistaken. And it almost breeds divisiveness, because let's have these people learn about each other and get a better understanding of where they stand and how they feel, and let's be empathetic to the struggle that they might be going through. So that's really what I'm trying to get at is I think educators can foster those conversations much better than the students having the conversation without a grown-up, a professional educator leading that discussion.
I kind of want to put a pin on that too, Mike, because something else that occurs to me, one, is that there have been strong discussions about the racial, gender, I guess, gender, disability, all these different identities when it comes to the teaching profession more generally. And so for me, I also feel like we do need to do a deep dive and interrogation of our implicit and explicit biases when it comes to ourselves, our students, and the communities that we serve. That's one element. And two, as I'm listening, and of course, again, like we know what's happening out there, whenever we say the words political correctness, for example, and that's what has consistently gets like thrown at any number of people, whether it be media, educators, politicians. Oh, you're being politically correct. I usually just replace those words with treating people like human beings worthy of dignity and respect. And so every time that I hear political correctness, I'm like, oh, you mean that I should treat people who are of the LGBTQIA plus community as people? Okay, cool. So like, yes, I am for that. And similarly, when it comes to our undocumented immigrants or people who are coming from different, and again, all across the world, right? We have people coming in, but unfortunately, like we already have a stereotype as to what that looks like. And so oftentimes I try to challenge people to say, we are trying to treat everybody with dignity and respect. And so that's a big reason why we're having this conversation around misinformation, is because so many of the stereotypes about people and people's lived experiences are often like thrown and ostracized and made into like little political tools to separate so many people, when we're really trying to seek ways to like come together and really build a democracy that speaks to everybody's lived experience and also being human with everybody else at the same time. And there's going to be limits to that, obviously. So that's going to push some things away, like ideas that are deleterious to that humanity. But the better that we can do that, that we're going to be able to pull more people in who are of the American ideal that we so espouse.
One of the things we were talking about when we were preparing for this was whether kids are too young to engage politically. I know we've established that kids are never too young to have a sense of justice and be cultivated in or have that sense of justice cultivated in them. But how do they bring that out into the world if you're teenager, maybe even younger, and how does that work within the context of the classroom? I think, Amanda, you had some good thoughts on that.
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about engaging genuine curiosity, right? There are times, and I think this is one of the spaces where as adults we can be worse, right? We carry all of our stuff with us, and there are times where I will admit I maybe haven't been genuinely curious, right? Like, I'm sorry, my ex was just wrong. That happens, and that is maybe not our best selves. And so, oftentimes when we're coming at these political issues, are we coming at them with genuine curiosity, or are we coming at it to just prove what we already believe, right? Which I think is when we get into that really dangerous kind of mis and disinformation spaces. And with young people, I think you have such this opportunity to foster that genuine curiosity, right? I think one of the things, to give a concrete example, is, there are definitely people who are very certain, I call it the big lie, which tells you where I'm coming from, right? But there are some people who are very certain that our election was incorrectly decided in 2020. I think that we have lots of facts that show that that is not true. And it is really easy in a lot of places in the country to dig into those facts with students, right? So in Colorado, county clerks are the ones who run the elections. Many of them do tours of ballot processing. They have videos of ballot processing available online. High school students can actually be election judges. And so there are all these ways, especially for young people, to see firsthand sort of how it works. And so there are these really lovely places where we can kind of get below some of those hot issues and say, hey, like, where are the spaces that we're genuinely curious and how can we get that information? And especially in the election world, which is where I live a lot of the time, there are really great spaces where you can explore that in a really transparent way.
And I would add, I think it is an educator's job to help prepare students to go out into the real world and to be engaged participants in their community. So we want educators to help students learn how to find information that will help them make decisions about who they're going to vote for, or what issues they care about, or what issues they want to act on in their community. So I think educators have a big role to play as far as that goes. And then just to add to what Amanda said, as far as the big lie goes, the big lie being that the election was stolen, there's no evidence. Like, what we encourage people to do is look for the evidence that supports that the election was stolen. And what you'll find is it's been debunked over and over again. There were no the courts that heard cases about that. I forget the exact number, but I think there were almost 50 cases that were brought, and I believe it was about 48 that were thrown out. So there was so little evidence to support that we just want people to really make decisions that are based on factual evidence, not your feelings. I can understand being hurt that your candidate lost, but sometimes that's one candidate wins and one candidate loses. That's the way it goes. So but to go back to your larger question, educators have a huge role in preparing our young people to be engaged participants in our communities and our democracy.
Anything from you, Jose?
I just want to acknowledge that this is a misinformation panel and a disinformation panel by proxy, and a lie. The word lie was just used, Dana. So good on us for doing so. And this actually has ramifications for our students, right? Because I know that a lot of us try to be gentle and fair when it comes to using words like lie, for example, and that there are sometimes that it may be appropriate, especially if the stakes are that high. And I think there are a lot of our communities that are seeking folks to say something that is a little bit more profound. And so there are times when I have had to be the one to step in and say, this was unfair, this was unjust, and have to put a little bit more oomph, because they were looking for that from me, not because they wanted some sort of bias, but because they wanted somebody to say this is a bad thing that just happened. And that includes, the shootings that have happened, 220 plus, right, over the last 114 days. And of course, any number of incidents that have happened, even in New York City. I'm like, oh my gosh, they're dealing with so much all the time. And so hopefully as a society, we can try to make a lot more changes so that we eventually get to the point when we can talk to ourselves honestly about what's happening. But until we get to that point, we're going to have conversations about what's a lie and what's not.
But I thought Amanda did a really great job earlier of defining disinformation, in that it's deliberate. You're being deliberately misled. And but I think we also just need to acknowledge it. This doesn't just apply to politics. Think about COVID and the vaccines that are there. Think about climate change and all the overwhelming evidence that shows it's real, but people will deliberately mislead you about that. Think about what's happening in Ukraine and how Russia has misled its citizens about the reasons for the war. So it's not always just a political, issue. It's really a matter of information that is crucial to the decisions that you'll make about your life.
And I think I just want to flag one more piece around what are those moments in our lives, in politics, in classrooms, where it feels really political, or it feels really uncomfortable, or it feels like you're touching on a really hot issue and you're not sure if you should do that in this polite space, right? I find that oftentimes when things feel like that, it's actually the moments that we are being challenged to center people of color, to center gay and trans people, to center folks who have been marginalized, that sometimes that is the time that feels like, oh, that's political, right? But in reality, what we're doing is we're acknowledging the complexity of all of our lives. And we're acknowledging that different people have different experiences of events. And so I just want to highlight that it is often worth pausing and asking yourself, why does this feel this way? Is it actually political, or is it about sort of honoring that complexity and humanity?
Well, and also understanding the difference between saying good and bad and just acknowledging the existence of a condition, right? It's not, my skin color is good, yours is bad. It's different. And that's kind of hard for people sometimes. At least it can be for me, and it does feel that it does take on a political tinge to it because we've been conditioned that way out in the media. We probably have room for one more question, and that comes from our someone in the audience who is also interested in learning about how teachers might help students get more involved with local politics. And I guess we thinking maybe about school boards or your town council, town board, city council, and wonder what you've been thinking about along those, since those have been increasingly crucial points of change, at least in Colorado, for when the pendulum swings, it swings big in local government here.
I would just add, because I'm sure y'all know a lot better than I do, but we've been privileged to have folks like Julia Torres, who's a librarian and English teacher out in Denver, Boulder area. There's something around, and actually Mount Bello High School was the last one before I think she went to Martin Luther King in the area. But there are a plethora of youth activism organizations out there, and of course, EduColor had the privilege of having Youth Celebrate Diversity (YCD) come through and have the conversation with us. I think that there's so much more like fire that's happening when it comes to student activism these days than I've seen in recent history, and that's been really awesome to see. So like, it really is just a matter of like going out there, getting like asking folks who you think might be able to point you in the right direction, and then leveraging that to like say, hey, like I want to get involved. And sometimes it's like the high school students, sometimes it's the climate change group, sometimes it's like I guess the other we have our gay straight alliances that are happening within different schools too, and I think those are really powerful spaces. But I would always suggest to everybody, like, don't try to start a whole brand new organization unless you really truly went and like research out there, but to actually like go join something that's already happening, so that way you feel like you're already part of the work instead of trying to replicate it over and over again. And I think building within an organization might be the best way for students to get really involved in local politics, because it shows that you know how to team build, you know how to work across different allegiances and alliances, and you know how to talk to the community members from intergenerationally, right? Like those are all really powerful tools for any youth to be able to tap into.
I get so excited about this. And I will also disclose, right, that like at one point I was like the world's worst person to date, because people would like complain about their everyday lives and I'm like, well, you can change that. We can find somebody to help run a bill. And they're like, I was really just complaining about my work. But I feel the same way about students, that there are so many times when young people are absolutely the experts, right? We think of policy experts, of people who have PhDs and masters in public administration, and you are probably the expert in a number of things that acutely impact your life. And you have so much access, particularly at the local level, to change things, even if you are too young to be eligible to vote yet. You can get a meeting with your, state senator or your local mayor, and you can lobby them. You can ask them to change things. You can help them understand issues that impact you, and your students can absolutely do that. Also, I will make a plug that in Colorado, 16-year-olds on up can pre-register to vote. So at the minute they turn 18, that ballot comes in the mail to them. At least in Democratic caucuses, if you are pre-registered to vote, you can actually participate in caucus and assembly. So you can have a say about who is on the ballot. So there are a number of things, both when it comes to voting and when it comes to making policy decisions, that young people absolutely can already get involved in. And a lot of the things might be things that don't quite feel political to them, but just feel important to their lives.
And I'll just add that, news literacy is not necessarily about trying to get students to be more politically active, but we do want you to be able to find information that's valid so that if you do choose to get involved, that you can make good decisions and be active and engaged citizens in your community. So, I just personally, again, I look at the kids from Stoneman Douglas who led the March for Our Lives here in DC and across the country. I think that when students find something that really matters to them and might make a difference in their lives, that's what draws them in, and that's what will get them active. And so I think if you can foster those kind of discussions in the classroom and help them find their way to that, you'll succeed.
And we just had Eric drop in the chat a story we did, I can't believe it's been 2 years, about a group of young Black women at Montbello High School who decided that they were unhappy with the way their history curriculum was going, and so started a podcast and did a great job on their own to sort of move the needle a little bit. And it's not, I think it was interesting because it wasn't like they had to go and completely change all curriculum for the state of Colorado, but they got engaged, they did their podcast, and they had an impact in their communities. And I think it's important for us to remember that kids have great ideas and we should listen to them and cultivate them as they become engaged members of our society as adults, voters, smart people with good foundations. So we are 2 minutes over. So I think we're going to have to wrap this up. I really appreciate the time that all y'all spent with us today. I know it's been a tough day for a lot of people and a lot of educators. So thank you for joining us and giving a thoughtful look at the way we can address politics and civic engagement in our classrooms in Colorado and in America. I appreciate our sponsors, the Colorado Education Association, and also the News Literacy Project for supporting this terrific set of conversations that we've had with the experts to help create a more literate society. And I guess we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up. So thank you guys so much for all your time.
Thank you all. Take care.
See you next time.